Look at this footage of a new building that could have been left, but the real estate market in China is in crisis and sales have been falling for months. Because of this, it is cheaper for developers to demolish a new building than to maintain it. The authorities support the demolitions, offsetting the costs. Already 2/3 of developers who are bankrupt or are in bankruptcy. And here is another news: Chinese chipmaker SMIC has achieved a family of nanometer technological breakthroughs, on a par with Intel, TSMC, and Samsung. It took the Chinese company 2 years to make the leap from 14 nanometers to 7 nanometers, which is faster than TSMC and Samsung. Experts said that SMIC has learned to produce families, nanometer chips, even without the most advanced manufacturing equipment. So what's really going on in something like this? Seemingly clear to everyone in China. In this documentary you will see this mysterious country from many angles, and it is this overview that will put together a multidimensional viewpoint that will be closest to reality. However, you will be able to give an assessment of it yourself after viewing it by writing in the comments what you think about it. And so let's begin. After all, today China is successfully implementing the most unprecedented, unparalleled in the world reforms. Their success is largely due to the funding from state banks, which control 90% of China's finances. Of course, it is not without corruption, and it is, in fact, part of the Chinese culture and the flesh of the clan system of power. In short, the scheme today is as follows. There is a whole caste of senior government officials, the so-called princes. These are mostly the children and grandchildren of Mao Zedong's associates, who, together with the great Stirner, built the modern Chinese People's Republic and formed the new Chinese elite. Behind such a prince is his own elite clan group with its own political and business interests, a set of instruments of influence, and the combined administrative resources of the positions held by its representatives. In turn, these clans are combined into more global elite corporations. Traditionally, there were two of them, the so-called Komsomol members, the heirs of the old Beijing Party elite, and the Shanghai clique, which mostly consisted of the descendants of the Chinese elite of the 1990s. More recently, the Xi Jinping clan, which previously belonged to the Shanghai clique, has also emerged as an independent elite corporation, but has moved away from them and rapidly increased the power of its clan. The clans have divided among themselves all spheres of influence in China. They control business, including the shadow, complex and confusing politics, the economic system, the combination of market and socialist patterns, the specific relationship with Hong Kong, the special status of Taiwan, and many other characteristic features of the Chinese economy create a huge shadow market, which is under the control of the clans, not to mention the rapidly growing economy, focused on both exports and the huge domestic market. The latest developments, modernization of the armed forces, its own space program, which create unprecedented flows of money and opportunities for the personal enrichment of officials. So all these fairy tales about shootings of corrupt officials in China, to put it mildly, are not true. One way or another, for 25 years, China moved into first place in the world in terms of gross domestic product. International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and even the CIA recognized it. The figures of the above organizations differ slightly from $17 to $18 trillion for the IMF. Americans are generally sad. A U.S. Senate investigation found that China supplies over 1 million different types of parts to the country's defense industry. At number 1 in the list of Chinese exports to the U.S. is a computer equipment. The list of U.S. exports to China is topped by scrap metal and industrial waste. The situation is familiar, isn't it? In addition to the West, where China is investing heavily, it has quietly occupied African countries, building roads, railroads, and airports, and linking the 54 countries together in a single infrastructure. China has invested in 1,000 African projects. Its peaceful annexation has extended to agriculture, infrastructure, manufacturing, and logistics. China has the world's largest reserves of 27 types of minerals. In fact, it is the world's only resource superpower, not Russia, as many think. For example, in 1 year China mined almost 80% of the world's antimony and tungsten. Rare earth metals are 85%, of which gold is 15%. China has the world's largest resources of shale gas, and in terms of reserves and consumption of hard coal is in first place. In recent years, China has produced 49% of the world's steel, 54% of iron, 47% of coal, 50% of iron ore, and 60% of cement. The US calculated that China produced more cement in 3 years than the States did in 100 years. That much could completely concrete the state of Hawaii. The only thing China seriously lacks is natural gas and oil, which it has to import from several countries, including Russia. True, the sensational Power of Siberia pipeline turned out to be non-commercial, as the Minister of Energy characterized it back in 2017, because this project will not pay for itself until at least 2048, but for China it is not vital. For them, it is a backup option. At the same time, as the only buyers, they will be able to dictate their price, so gas specialists call the pipeline a costly show-off, similar to the Sakhalin-Khabarovsk-Vladivostok gas pipeline opened in 2011, which also turned out to be of no use to anyone. One often hears that if China is the world's factory, then the environmental situation there is the worst. This is partly true. However, this is slightly outdated information. First, the Chinese government has been shutting down tens of thousands of plants across the country in recent years. Many chemical production facilities are being shut down in a planned fashion or are being launched again in a planned modernization. All toxic chemical production is being moved outside the city limits, and in harmful production is being exported to significantly less fussy countries whose governments are willing to turn a blind eye to black snow and pink rivers in exchange for generous Chinese loans. For example, Hebei province alone has more than 700 steel and cement companies, some of the dirtiest industries. The neighboring countries of Central and Southeast Asia have transferred capacity. One company has bought the assets of an unprofitable steel plant in Serbia and invested $300 million in its reconstruction. And agreements have been signed with Kazakhstan for more than $20 billion on the conditions and amounts of Chinese loans for the transfer of production facilities in Kazakhstan or the construction of new ones. After all, what? In the last 20 years, China has increased the length of its high-speed roads by 10 times. Out of the world's 330,000 kilometers of high-speed roads, China owns 112,000. More than 300,000 bridges have been built in China, and of the 10 largest bridges in the world, half are in China. Among other things, this requires the highest qualifications of engineers and a high level of engineering education. The world's longest viaduct with a length of 164.8 kilometers, listed in the Guinness Book of Records, is for the Chinese high-speed railway line. And Chinese railway stations in Guangzhou, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Wuhan and many other cities are many times larger and more comfortable than the largest railway stations in Europe. Chinese Three Gorges hydroelectric power plant is the largest in the world. 22,000 megawatts. China is successfully implementing an ambitious program for the study and exploration of the moon. Not forgotten, even Antarctica here opened in recent years 5 permanent polar stations. Coronavirus outbreak certainly affected the economy of China. Its losses in Q1 2020 are about 1% of the country's GDP. At the same time, the country's leadership constantly declares the temporary and short-term nature of the impact of the epidemic, and there are good reasons for such a statement. One is the construction of hospitals as a clear demonstration of China's capabilities. Impressively, the new 1,500-bed hospital was built just days after the first 1,000-bed hospital, with state-of-the-art medical equipment and special isolation boxes, began to admit patients. What is needed is an idea that meets the interests of the global community, and in this sense China, in the best tradition of behind-the-scenes puppeteers, can only offer an electronic digital concentration camp, which has already been practically implemented in its own country. This system was most fully tested on the Muslim Uyghurs, a people in the top 5 national minorities prohibited from developing their own languages and writing systems or preserving or reforming national customs, which led to mass protests. In 2009, in the capital of Xinjiang, Urumqi, the police tried to disperse the riots escalated into pogroms, killing 197 people, mostly Chinese. Authorities arrested 1,000 protesters, at least 30 of whom were sentenced to death by firing squad. In response, the Uyghurs turned to terrorist attacks, primitive, poorly organized, but regular. In 2018, China announced for the first time the existence of re-education facilities where Uyghurs and other Muslims, such as Kazakhs, are helped to straighten their thoughts and correct their behavior. Re-education is not considered criminal punishment in China. Formal charges are not brought, so there are no statistics. Nevertheless, the scale of repression is visible even from abroad. Camps can be found on satellite imagery. Information is scarce because entire areas of China remain closed to foreign media, and in Xinjiang it is even less accessible. But there is talk, not only of abuse and corporal punishment, but also of organ trafficking. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination explicitly called Xinjiang a territory resembling one giant concentration camp, suggesting that 1 million people are imprisoned in the transformation centers. The World Uyghur Congress believes that the real figure could be as high as 3 million. Almost a third of the entire population, the remaining two-thirds live under constant video surveillance and total control. Goes to the next block after a retinal scan, they have a mandatory special application for surveillance in their smartphones, so you can't complain in the messengers either. In general, everything in the best traditions of dystopias. On the crest of these events, the emergence of the idea called in Beijing the discrete term social trust system looks quite natural. In 2016, at a meeting of the Politburo, President Xi Jinping said that to combat the acute problem of the lack of trust, it is necessary to improve both the mechanisms of encouragement, law-abiding and conscientious citizens, and mechanisms of punishment, so that a person simply does not dare to lose confidence. Appropriate technology has been developed, and now every resident of mainland China is evaluated by the said system in real time. Obtaining a trust rating, all of its residents are given a starting rating with a certain number of points. Whether it rises or falls is in direct correlation with everyone's behavior. If the rating is high, it is a saintly citizen who is entitled to all sorts of benefits. For example, to get a big unsecured loan. Below the average, expect trouble. For example, they can fire him from the civil service. At the lowest mark, a person becomes an outcast, he cannot find a job, take a loan, buy tickets, the neighbors will stay away from him than from a carrier of the coronavirus. Clear rules of the game have not yet been spelled out for the people. The government agencies, law enforcement and municipal authorities are watching. In addition, data is collected and stored by 8 private companies, among which the most famous is the Alibaba Group. The police using smart glasses established the identity of the person in 23 minutes, enough to scan his face and contact the database. Except that the society of total control knows no boundaries. The electronic concentration camp, like any other, is first and foremost the unconditional obedience of the herd. Chinese citizens become unified elements, which was written about in the Committee of 300. They will be relegated to the level and behavior of trained animals. To tourists arriving in China, border guards secretly install applications on their smartphones. It collects data for catching content, which in China is banned. In China, freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution, but in practice the state controls all sources of information, up to the foreign films, books and video games supplied to the country. According to China's Press Freedom Index, China's media independence ranked 176 out of 180 countries in 2017. The majority of the population does not see this as a big problem, and it is largely due to historical traditions. Even the first emperor of China, who unified the country, ordered to destroy all books, conquered provinces, except works on medicine, fortune-telling and agriculture, and banned all philosophical currents, except the doctrine, which was based on the strict implementation of state laws. There are pluses to total control, although to some they may seem questionable. Remember how the digital girl in Blade Runner 2049 changed her outfits? Such scenes are cut out in China because of censorship, but that is changing as well. Usually movies in China were released about a month after the world premiere, while the party would review the material while they approved it. Now, however, films, on the contrary, start before the world premiere, such as Pacific Frontier 2. All because the franchise was bought by the Chinese. Now the film doesn't need to be censored because it's made to Chinese standards, so the bosses of the Chinese film industry started buying up packs of promising projects. The Chinese market is growing fast, with 5 times more potential viewers than, for example, in the US, so Hollywood is increasingly adjusting to the Chinese distribution rule. Terminator Genesis has taken most of the box office in China. The Avengers is released closer to the Chinese New Year, and the Transformers is played by a Chinese woman. It is much easier not to cut the finished film, but release it initially suitable for the format of the largest market. It is commonly believed that there is little corruption in China, because it is fought uncompromisingly and constantly. The death penalty can be imposed on any official caught engaging in corrupt practices, which makes the economy in China dozens of times more efficient. Is this true? In just 10 minutes we will thoroughly dissect this question, and the information at the end of the video may slightly shock you. Let's go! The real corruption came to China together with the Europeans. The story is that after the defeat in the First Opium War and the Second Opium War with the British, China was forced to sign the bondage agreements, which, in addition to the huge contribution of contributions, enshrined the rights of the British to conduct virtually unlimited trade activities in China. In fact, these agreements legitimized the corrupt arrangements made by the British smugglers, which encouraged and nurtured rampant corruption among Chinese officials, and the weak imperial government, after 2 crushing military defeats, did not dare to oppose these processes. The image of the official traitor who helped foreigners rob China and profited from exploiting the people was firmly entrenched in Chinese culture. At the same time, in addition to systemic Western corruption, China has always had its own traditions of enrichment at the expense of the state treasury and self-serving use of one's official position. This is because the Chinese mentality is based on the special role of family ties, where loyalty to one's family takes precedence over all other values. For example, Confucian tenets place reverence for parents even higher than loyalty to the state and the law. Private, family and community ties require the assistance of relatives and community members, and this assistance must be given, and especially if one of the family has obtained a good position. The career advancement of a successful person in China is perceived as primarily the result of the work of his entire family and only secondarily as his personal merit. At one time there was even a system of reverse nobility in China. The nobility was not inherited by the descendant of a man who had served, as was common in European countries, but rather by the parents and grandfathers of a successful official. It is clear that a Chinese official who has made a career will always help his family in every way, including using all the resources of his position. It is absolutely normal in the society if an official gives preferences to his relative in commerce, uses his administrative resources in his favor, hires relatives. Nepotism and nepotism are not only not condemned, but on the contrary, they are taken for granted. Such loyalty is typical of the phenomenon which in our society is called a bribe. It is part of Chinese business culture to give part of one's profits to the person whose efforts have led to a profitable deal. This business culture permeates Chinese society to the very top. If at the grassroots level nepotism is a family affair, at the top of the political system there is a huge clan of officials. Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, is the son of Mao Zedong, an associate, that is, in our words, a major Boyd. Last year for the first time the US lost to China for the number of richest people. According to the annual report, there are 100 million Chinese among the 10% richest people in the world. In the US, the figure was 99 million people. Remember the famous Panamanian scandal about offshore companies, of which the story of the cellist Roljan was the most unexpected for Russians? After that they started to call him Putin's purse. So, too, the Panama dossier revealed information on the Chinese power clan. Among the high-ranking owners of offshore firms are Jasmine Li, the granddaughter of Chinese leader Zhe Qinglin, President Xi Jinping's son-in-law, the daughter of the Politburo Standing Committee, the wife of former Politburo member Bo Xilai, brother of former Vice President Zhen Zheong and son of former Politburo member Tian Jian, and many, many others. Under the well-established planned political system, the struggle between the power elite groups for resources of money flows, especially in an ever-growing economy, is inevitable, and the fight against corruption, all these public shootings of corrupt officials, are largely a tool to clean up the enemies and to pacify the rebellious elite groups. A large-scale anti-corruption campaign began when Chinese President Xi Jinping came to power. Since then, 1.5 million officials have been punished for violation of party discipline and corruption. Before Xi Jinping, the Chinese authorities preferred to punish corrupt officials in public. There are 45 articles in China's criminal code that provide for capital punishment. Under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, China regularly carried out executions. In 2011, for example, high-ranking party bosses were executed in 2 major cities, but during the 6 years of Xi Jinping's rule, Chinese officials got used to other rules, and only one vice-mayor of the city of Luiliang Zheng Zhongxing was executed for bribes totaling $160 million. The executions stopped, but the number of cases against corrupt officials grew exponentially. Under Xi Jinping, a new special agency against corruption was actually created. Its name is the Central Commission for Verification of Party Discipline. This commission is more influential than the police, state security, other special services of the country. It has its own inquiries and prisons. It is headed by a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, one of the 7 immortal, as they are called in China, a personal friend of Xi Jinping's countryman and right hand. In each province, city, county, compromat on party officials is collected. Naturally, relying on the people, special websites have been opened, where one can send information on anyone. In 2015 alone, according to Chinese statistics, there were 2,800,000 signals from workers about bribe takers. Speaking of the death penalty, the Chinese penal code is quite strict, and the current pandemic situation is a good example of this. For example, patients with confirmed infection, as well as carriers of the pathogen who refuse quarantine and treatment or violate quarantine regulations on their own, and who visit public places and transport, can be sentenced to death. A special point highlighted for officials: the highest penalty can be applied to those who will abuse their official position for embezzlement, theft, fraud, and other ways of misappropriation of goods and money intended to prevent and control various kinds of disasters, infectious epidemics in China. Chinese fighters against corruption have developed their own slang, so to speak, zoological. Tigers are called for those who have corrupted party bosses, foxes for those who manage to get a day. According to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, about 18,000 corrupt functionaries who illegally appropriated about $131 billion have fled the country. Traces of the criminals are lost in the Western world, Japan, and Thailand. Today, Beijing is trying in various ways to recover these funds. For example, in the first 10 months of 2019, China repatriated 1,634 suspected fugitives suspected of corruption. A 70% increase over the same period last year. During the same period in 2019, law enforcement agencies were able to recover $420 million in illicitly gained funds. China is constantly strengthening international anti-corruption cooperation. In 2014, for example, at the APEC summit in Beijing, an agreement was formalized to create an anti-corruption mechanism for the entire Asia-Pacific region. Unlike cunning faces, small flies and self-righteous tigers do not acquire secret accounts. This applies even to the party elite. 2 stories made a lot of noise in 2018. The deputy minister of the coal industry kept 33 million euros at home. It was taken out by truck. The deputy head of Tianjin County hid jewels in frozen fish carcasses. Another interesting category is that of naked officials. This is the boss who hid all his money in an offshore, who sent his family abroad, but who continues to sit in his chair and take bribes. In his homeland he has practically nothing, although he does have something: a Canadian or Bahamian passport. So he can move to Hong Kong any minute, fly out of there and join the army of foxes. For Beijing, among other things, fighting corruption is an effective way to ease social tensions in the country. The income gap between the rich and the poor in China is one of the largest in the world. Obviously, the rapid enrichment of business representatives would not take place without well-established ties to party officials, so high-ranking communists can incur the wrath of the people and defend themselves. Remarkably, when in 2012 the party leadership proposed introducing a system of public disclosure of officials' personal wealth, 98.7% of delegates to the National People's Congress voted against such a decision. Does not it sound familiar? When handing over power to his successor Xi Jinping, the former leader of China Hu Jintao said explicitly that if we do not solve the issue of corruption, it is fraught with fatal consequences for the communist movement. It could lead to the fall of the party, he said at the 18th Party Congress. And now every year the authorities report an increase in the number of corruption cases. Recently, the population was delighted by the news: the prison for officials of the class at Xinjiang in the north of Beijing is overcrowded. Prisoners denied visits, with no place to receive their relatives due to lack of space. This is the history of corruption in China. Maybe there are some things we should learn from the positive experience? Well, for example, what do you think of the idea of building a prison for Class A officials not far from Moscow? What do you think? Write in the comments. It will be interesting for everyone to read. Not so long ago, China was considered to be not much of a factory on the planet. A country that invented nothing and only assembled goods according to other people's blueprints. Because international corporations moved production there to use cheap labor, but now you will see striking figures, after which you will have no doubt that this country is now one of the world leaders in science and technology. Go! In 2020, while the whole world was fighting you know what, the Chinese government spent $378 billion on research and development, R&D, applied scientific, and by comparison, Russia, on the contrary, is reducing this amount. The Russians call it spending on R&D, research and development. Well, look at the numbers. In 2020 about $7 billion was spent on them. And in 2021 they plan to spend around $6. It's an interesting comparison, isn't it? Almost 407. Today, every 5 published scientific papers are written by Chinese scientists, and in the next 5 years the Chinese government plans to spend 10% more money on pure science. And this isn't just unnecessary basic science for highbrow philosophers. Chinese science is increasingly intertwined with business. In 2019, the government announced that scientists now have the right to take up to 6 years off to create their own startups. At the same time, they continue to receive a salary and benefits, and their services for this period are counted in the academic system as scientific activity. The Chinese government creates the most favorable conditions for scientists and businessmen if they work in certain areas, which the leadership of the country considers a priority. Thus, in the 14th Five-Year Plan, China pays the most attention to artificial intelligence, semiconductors, quantum computers, neuroscience, and genetics. Let's look at why these areas are of paramount importance and what state they are in now. Artificial intelligence. There are now 2 main competitors in this area, China and the USA. China's main advantage in this race is its 1.4 billion inhabitants, of which 1 billion are active users of the internet. People produce data, and this is the fuel on which the artificial intelligence rocket takes off. Professor Kai-Fu Lee, one of the leading experts in the field of AI, says China has the most users, and they produce an incredible amount of data, as Chinese life is saturated with digital services. For example, there are almost no credit cards or cash in China. Everyone uses mobile payments, which means it produces data, which AI performs better on. Professor Lee has been a top executive at Microsoft, Apple, and Google, so anyone who wants to be in the loop listens to what he has to say. He predicts that artificial intelligence will be part of every business in the next 5 to 10 years. Companies will use it as extensively as the internet and data analytics do now. He compared it to the time when electricity replaced theater and opera. Well, with the development of the internet, everyone went to YouTube and tic-tac-toe. China is already ahead of the US and the world in such an area of artificial intelligence as facial recognition. This technology is highly dependent on the amount of data collected, and in China they collect the most. There are 9 of the 10 most watched cities and more than half of all surveillance cameras in the world. In many ways, the leadership of Chinese companies in facial recognition systems is due to the fact that Chinese law does not prevent the collection and processing of visual data, and even encourages it. Face recognition technology. This is part of computer vision, and its use is not limited to surveillance of citizens. It is used, for example, in medicine, unmanned cars, and in factories. Recently, Chinese universities have created hundreds of new places for AI professors and opened more than 100,000 institutions for teaching AI. As a result, in 2020, China has already surpassed the US in terms of citations of scientific papers on AI. Semiconductors. No modern technology is possible without a computer, and no computer is possible without a processor, aka a microchip, aka a semiconductor. In 2020, because of the pandemic, the world was plunged into a microprocessor crisis. Work became remote, the demand for computer hardware increased, and the world dramatically needed more processors, but the production chains were broken by lockdown, because manufacturing is a global process. Most circuits are invented in the US, assembled in Asia, and the resource for them is mined all over the world. China was the first country to emerge from the semiconductor crisis, because it was the best prepared for it. While other countries spent money on fighting the coronavirus, China was actively buying up microprocessors. Every $5 China spent on imported products went for semiconductors. A total of $380 billion was spent on them. As a result, many countries began to experience a shortage of chips, and Chinese corporations like Huawei had plenty in stock. The thing is that back in 2018, Donald Trump threatened to ban the sale of microchips to some Chinese companies, and China realized its vulnerability. After all, China uses 60% of all microprocessors in the world. For goods for the domestic market and for export, but they produce only 1/3 of the semiconductors they need. If you deprive it of external supplies, all production will stop, so the strengthening of the production of microprocessors in China as a priority. For example, in 2020, investment in Chinese semiconductor firms have increased by 4 times compared with the previous year. Processor factories are some of the most complex production structures. It takes a lot of time and money to build them. To make a factory work, it needs to be equipped with complex and expensive hardware, rare materials, and high-class specialists. Until recently, microchip production was a small bunch of companies that monopolized the market, but against the background of a sharp shortage of chips, the market quickly democratized. Everybody needs factories, so in 2021 not only specialized corporations like Intel and Qualcomm, but also such techno giants as Apple, Google, and Amazon were engaged in their construction. In China, the world-renowned smartphone and computer manufacturers Xiaomi, Huawei, and Oppo are starting to make their own processors. China's main search engine Baidu has taken up manufacturing chips for smart cars. Jack Ma's Alibaba now produces chips for AI cloud computing. And ByteDance owns TikToks for its servers. In short, the Chinese take microprocessors as seriously as possible, so now they've thrown everything at their production, so it's likely that soon China will break into the leaders in the production of microchips, and then the US will no longer be able to scare them with sanctions in this area. Quantum computing. At the end of 2019, Google claimed to have achieved quantum superiority. Their Sycamore quantum processor handled calculations in minutes that would have taken a normal supercomputer 10,000 years, and at the end of the pandemic, new 2020 Chinese scientists reported that their Zhejiang photonic quantum computer broke Google's record. In a matter of minutes, it handled calculations that the world's third most powerful supercomputer would have taken 2 billion years to complete. For quantum computers to work properly and produce reliable calculation results, they need to be completely isolated from the environment, including temperature and electromagnetic influences, and this is not yet physically feasible, so their calculations remain noisy. The environment affects the accuracy of the result, and to get an accurate answer, scientists correct the results of quantum calculations with other calculations, also very complicated. Today there are about 24 models of quantum computers, and so far no one knows which of them will prove to be the most efficient. For example, Google has demonstrated quantum superiority with superconductors, and Chinese scientists with photons, and both models work for a very narrow range of tasks. Nevertheless, in the coming years, the main race will unfold in the practical application of imperfect noisy quantum technologies. One of today's leading scientists in quantum physics is Pan Jianwei of China, whom Nature magazine calls the father of the quantum. It was he who oversaw the creation of the computer that demonstrated quantum superiority, and in 2017 he made a breakthrough in quantum communication and cryptography. Then the Chinese satellite Nicias, using photons in a quantum state, allowed a video conference between China and Vienna that could not be hacked. Neuroscience. It is believed that in the next decade we will see a boom in new computer architectures, and one of the most promising trends is considered to be neuromorphic computers. Developers are inspired by the structure of the human brain and use deep learning systems to create them. Neuromorphic systems will better analyze neurostructured information, which can bring humanity closer to creating the strongest AI. That is, AI capable of thinking and self-awareness. This is exactly how science fiction writers like to imagine AI. In this area, Chinese scientists from Tsinghua University, the alma mater of Secretary General Xi Jinping, are particularly prominent. They were the first to present a model of neuromorphic completeness, that is, a working model of a neuromorphic computer in several articles for the journal Nature. They also created a Tianjin chip that works on the principle of biological neural networks, which can already be embedded in autonomous bicycles. But even more interesting are Chinese developments in human brain research. The West has heard about neural implants and brain computers from Elon Musk's Neuralink company, but while Musk is experimenting on pigs and monkeys, China has been testing the interaction between neural implants and the brains of real people for years. In the early 2000s, Chinese scientists conducted experiments on drug-addicted rats and macaques, and operations on the brains of these animals led to a marked reduction in addiction. In 2004, Chinese neurosurgeons performed at least 1,000 operations on the brains of opioid-dependent people. Overall, the experiment was considered successful as it led to relapse reduction of the operated drug addicts, and only some of them had noticeable side effects. And in 2010, Chinese scientists switched from simple operations to neuromodulation techniques, enhancement or suppression of brain activity using brain-implanted devices. In 2019, the world learned the story of Yang, a 33-year-old man addicted to methamphetamine. He was brought to the neuro clinic by his father, who gave him an ultimatum to either go back to rehab or to neurosurgery. Ian chose neurosurgery and deep brain stimulation. He had his skull drilled in 2 places, had electrodes implanted in his brain and a battery pack for the brain electrodes sewn into his chest. Now the doctor can control the activity of the electrodes implanted in Jan's brain using an app on his tablet. This machine is pure magic, Yang says. The doctor tells it to make you happy and you feel happy, or to make you nervous and you feel nervous. It controls your happiness, anger, sorrow and joy. Genetics. The success of Chinese geneticists is recognized by scientists around the world. For example, China ranks second after the United States in the number of scientific articles in the field of biomedical engineering, but Chinese geneticists have been linked to a series of scandals, mostly caused by violations of generally accepted moral and ethical standards. In 2001, for example, a Chinese scientist raised rabbit embryos in a laboratory with skin cell nuclei taken from a 7-year-old boy. From the resulting hybrids could be used to take embryonic stem cells. Thanks to Chinese experiments with the CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing technique on monkeys, humanity has learned that embryo DNA circulates in the mother's blood. In 2018, Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui announced that he had used CRISPR-Cas9 to successfully modify the DNA of human embryos and make them less vulnerable to HIV.
A Chinese court severely convicted He Jiankui for chasing fame and profit, jailed for 3 years, and fined him 3 million yuan, $430,000. In 2019, geneticists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences modified the genes of crabapple macaques to cause autistic behavior in those. This has helped to better understand the nature of autistic disorder. At the same time, they are already successfully cloning primates and supplying scientists around the world with 95% transgenic monkeys for a variety of experiments. The Chinese company BGI Group is one of the world leaders in genome sequencing, human, animal, and plant. BGI was founded by scientist Yan Wang in 1999 as a non-governmental research institute to participate in an international human genome project. The BGI and Yan worked closely with state universities, exchanging experiences and scientists. Over time, BGI evolved into a commercial company, although cooperation with the government did not end. This intertwining of the private and the state is an absolute norm for China. The BGI is responsible for China's national genetic database, to which projects such as this one are indirectly linked. The Chinese police intend to collect blood from 700 million Chinese boys and men to create a genetic database. This ambitious goal was set after a successful experiment in Hunan province, where police collected blood samples from 550,000 men over 2 years. China now possesses a database of 80 million genetic profiles, the largest in the world, and it has every chance of becoming a world leader in genetics. The strength of the Chinese scientific industrial complex lies in the cooperation of the state and corporations. The state acts as a big brother, gives grants to scientists, exempts companies from taxes, creates special conditions at the level of legislation, provided that the goals of scientists and businessmen coincide with the goals of the party. Of course. What do you say after all this? Agree, one gets the impression that we live on some different planets. But just how friendly is such a Chinese planet with all these frightening technologies in the end to humans? Let us now look at how Beijing is rolling out a massive multi-million-dollar program to promote the party's ideology and regulate the entertainment industry. In the past few years, the Chinese Communist Party has been actively engaged in propaganda. Chinese citizens, enriched by the course towards a market economy, no longer show their former unity with the party line, but have become increasingly active in the consumption of Western goods and works of Western culture. Last year was particularly fruitful from this point of view. The party took control of the Chinese IT and online education sectors, but the Communist Party did not limit its attack on technology companies because the profit of the entertainment industry in China was approximately $357 billion in 2021 and will grow to $437 billion by 2025. Not surprisingly, the popular movie show and the leisure activities of the Chinese in general have already come under the spotlight of the authorities. Look, these are the centers of practice of New Age civilization. A kind of Chinese houses of culture and leisure centers. Since 2018, more than 100,000 such organizations have been built in China. From 2018 to 2021, China's regional authorities have spent a total of more than $110 million on this large-scale project. The program of the centers varies from political information lessons to all kinds of educational and recreational activities. For example, the program of the center in Guangzhou includes cooking master classes on local Cantonese cuisine and lectures on the latest technology in the field of drones. One Shanghai Center studies the city's role in key historical events of the Communist Party of China, and there are yoga classes, a cappella singing, and a free screening of the Christopher Nolan action movie, The Dark Knight 2008, which put the citizens' education under the rubric. About 140 million volunteers have been recruited to work in them. They give lessons and master classes, travel to remote areas, collecting folklore, as well as teach villagers financial literacy and provide a wide range of services. At first glance, these seem like normal leisure centers, where you can learn to cook for free, watch a movie, do yoga, or figure out how modern technology works. But the motives of the authorities investing so many resources into these centers are quite transparent. The main task of the centers is to form new citizens with new habits, and to promote President Xi Jinping's ideas about specific Chinese socialism. After all, the wealthy Chinese as a whole are increasingly less interested in politics, including the activities of the party. On the one hand, this is a sign of a stable society, but on the other hand, it cannot but worry the authorities. To regain influence, the party is using popular trends as a new format of propaganda. The Chinese authorities have also developed other mechanisms through which they are trying to convey their ideology not only to the inhabitants of the country, but also to the whole world. One of these methods is the editing of foreign films. At the end of January 2022, an iconic American film from 1999, Fight Club, was added to the popular Chinese video streaming platform Tencent, but the ending was changed to something more appropriate for the Chinese authorities. In the original version, Edward Norton's character kills his imaginary alter ego Tyler Durden, who organized terrorist attacks on bank buildings, after which he sees explosions. In the new ending, the audience was not shown the explosions, but before the credits there was an announcement that the police had discovered the plot, arrested the criminals and sent Durden to the asylum. Thus, David Fincher's cult film, based on the book by the no less cult writer Chuck Palahniuk, suddenly became 11 minutes shorter and ended with a happy ending. Apparently, the ending, where the authorities do not win or restore order, was deemed unacceptable to Chinese audiences by the censors. Changing the ending of the film led to a surge of bewilderment in foreign media. Even more surprising was that the streaming platform soon returned David Fincher's original ending. Such pliability is rather rare for Chinese censorship. True, the cut sex scenes were not returned to the film. Of course, Fight Club is not the only foreign film to be censored by the Chinese authorities. China has long had an influence on films, not only domestically, but around the world. And that's not surprising, since China is one of the most attractive markets for foreign films. Until 2020, China was the number 2 box office destination after the United States and Canada, but in 2021, China surpassed the United States and came out on top of the world in box office receipts. In recent years, major releases have made more money in China than in America. Back in 2013, Xi Jinping said that new ways to tell China's story well needed to be found. Since then, to gain access to the lucrative Chinese market, American filmmakers need to avoid certain topics such as sex, LGBTQ+ issues, crime, violence, or depictions of China that do not meet the party's standards. Films that could threaten national security, harm national interests, and violate the country's territorial integrity are not allowed. Given the appeal of the Chinese market, some foreign studios are changing films themselves to please Chinese regulators. As a result, some of Hollywood's most famous films exist in several versions, for the world and for China. For example, the 2012 James Bond film Skyfall required the censors to cut a scene in which a Chinese security guard is killed, as well as references to sex, work, and police torture. China has a very strong position, because its film industry at this stage has reached such a level that it can easily do without the products of Hollywood. Most of the revenues of cinemas come from the distribution of Chinese rather than foreign films. So now Western producers and directors are more interested in China than China is in them. The Chinese authorities are not only showing their citizens the right movies, but are also increasing their control over private media. In October 2021, China's main economic planning body, the State Development and Reform Committee, published a draft ban on private news media. It states that media outlets not controlled by the state cannot collect and distribute news on Chinese territory. Therefore, only state-owned media may soon remain in China. The Foreign Correspondents Club of China, which the authorities consider an illegal organization based on their study, has issued a report according to which press freedom in China is diminishing at a dizzying rate. And of course, control of the IT sector. Back in 2014, Beijing began to closely monitor the impact of US sanctions on Russia. So when the first large-scale US trade sanctions hit China's economy in 2017, it was well prepared for them, and although the US sanctions, which deprived leading Chinese companies of the ability to buy or produce on imported equipment, chips, and other components, fine products showed unacceptable for Beijing's level of dependence on Western countries in the field of high technology. The conclusions: Beijing has made retaliatory moves, fearing to fall behind the US in key areas of 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. Beijing is demanding that national technology companies act as one team. In fact, we are talking about educational measures designed to rally business under the banners of power. What is the educational effect? For example, in the pressure on the largest companies that were going to hold an IPO. About a year ago, the owner of TikTok company ByteDance postponed plans to go public indefinitely after a confidential communication with representatives of the People's Bank of China. Earlier, similar difficulties were encountered by and Jack Ma Groups, which owns China's largest digital payment platform Alipay and serves about 1 billion users in China alone. In October 2020, authorities forced the company to abandon the largest IPO in world history, and also fined it $2.8 billion for illegal activities without specifying details. And DD Group's company, the main Chinese aggregator of cabs and car sharing, immediately after going to IPO became the target of criticism from regulators and the application code. They have been ordered to conduct internal audits and correct business practices that limit competition, and most importantly to tighten the rules for handling users' personal data to prevent it from leaking overseas. Beijing believes that US companies' access to information about the behavior and habits of Chinese users creates political risks. The US will be able to better understand domestic political processes in China, predict specific steps of the authorities inside and outside the country. And as the cherry on the cake, back in June 2017, the National Intelligence Law, unprecedented in the world practice, was adopted. It obliges all Chinese citizens and companies to cooperate with the institutions of the intelligence community in protecting the state's sovereignty and national interests. In Shanghai, one positive PCR test is enough to remove a mother's 2-year-old child or kill her pets. This is called a zero-tolerance policy. Separated from their children, parents cannot get information about what is wrong with them for days at a time. People have their apartment doors sealed to keep them in isolation. Food is delivered to them by couriers, but they simply cannot keep up with the flow of orders. As a result, the cooped-up residents are screaming out the windows, and it's often not even that they're outraged, but that they're starving, and some are fishing with a drone like this. That's how the Chinese government is. It's taken over the national IT giants, surrounds ordinary citizens with attention and care from all sides, protects them from unnecessary information, choosing suitable films and teaching them financial literacy, and, if necessary, can even lock them in their apartments. What do you think? How effective and useful are these methods? In 2010, the main focus of the Chinese was the copying of expensive brands. Here are a few of the most scandalous and famous examples. Landwind X7, which has completely repeated the English Range Rover, Lifan 320, which is as 2 peas in a pod like a Mini Cooper, or Zodi SR9 in the style of Porsche Macan. But how are the gigs on the Chinese market today? The first electric sports car Neo EP9. The batteries are placed on each side of the car for better weight distribution, and instead of the floor is a huge diffuser for better flowability. Each wheel is equipped with a separate electric motor with a reduction gear, which helps Neo to produce 1360 horsepower. The car weighs a few hundred pounds less than the same Bugatti Chiron. That's why it has an outstanding acceleration dynamics of 2.7 seconds to 100 kilometers per hour. Such characteristics have helped Neo to become the champion among electric cars on the famous Nürburgring. The next member of this category is the Tecrolls RN/RS, which with its pure looks makes it clear that it was designed by Italians.
Incredible lines in the style of Lamborghini, the central location of the pilot in the manner of McLaren F1, for electric motors with a total capacity of 1305 horsepower to accelerate to 100 km per hour. This car outran its competitor, NIO, as it accelerates to 102.5 seconds. With all this and a good power reserve of electric motors considerable 1,170 km with a full fuel tank. Another successful project supported by Europeans this time, the Spaniards became a hypercar Arcfox GT. The body is a streamlined monocoque and is available in two configurations. Road Coupe has 4 electric motors with a peak capacity of 1632 horsepower, and a racing version got a huge anti-fender with 6 electric motors, which in total produced 1020 horsepower and twice the Newton torque. Up to 100, this instance accelerates in 2.6 seconds, which is slightly inferior to the dynamics of the previous car. And finish the review of Chinese hypercars at the most unexpected instance of Hongqi S9. In general, the company is known for its super luxury sedans for Chinese officials, members of the government. In general, the so-called important people. The 4-liter V8 engine with 2 turbochargers acts in tandem with 3 electric motors. The output is cumulative 1400 horsepower. Acceleration to 100 in 1.9 seconds and a top speed of more than 400 km per hour. It would seem cooler and more powerful than all the competitors, but as always there is one but: the range in electric mode is 40 kilometers. Of course, all of these hypercars are obviously not for mere mortals, but there is good news for residents of rural Chinese hinterland. For example, NIO ES6 and ES8. Of course, these NIO is not for serial production. It is still only a statement of grand intentions in this vein. An aluminum electric crossover with 600 horsepower and acceleration to 100 in 5 seconds. But the most interesting solution in this model is replaceable batteries, which are charged outside the car itself. Another crossover, BYD Tang 2 generation, has not only become an excellent competitor for the NIO, but also reached the mass buyer with the design. True, the Chinese again helped Italians, and nameplate 4.3S means nothing more than the acceleration time to 100 km per hour. This crossover has several options: electric, hybrid and a gasoline variant. All of them differ in cost and characteristics, and the most powerful hybrid version in total produces almost 450 horsepower. However, love to copying has not disappeared from Chinese people. Well, or let's say, it has transformed a little bit. Here are a couple of examples. ORA is a daughter company of Great Wall, which has presented its CAT electric car concept, which vaguely reminds something between Porsche Panamera and Volkswagen Beetle. And in the showroom you will meet nothing else but a Bugatti, and another model from the company ORA, this time called Punk Cat, which this time frankly looks like a 4-door variation of the Volkswagen Beetle, a little sprinkled with echoes of the Mini Cooper. Despite the fact that it's a 2021 concept, it's clearly influenced by the nostalgic past. The car looks as old school as possible, but also really looks like a retro car, and the modernity of the car says its electric motor and interior full of electronics. There are also futuristic drones of Thai Google, Beidou. China is rightfully considered a pioneer in the survey of state regulation of drones. It is one of the first countries to have unified drone regulations across the country, and local businesses are actively involved in creating autonomous vehicles. For example, the largest search engine Beidou at its annual conference showed a prototype car in which the driver's seat is not marked in principle. The concept was an autonomous capsule with gull-wing-like doors and a large multimedia system screen in place of the traditional torpedo and controls. Instead of the driver, the latest Kunlun 2 chip with artificial intelligence is responsible for driving. In total, there are more than 30 companies in China that are developing drones, with the coronavirus not hindering them. In the first 4 months of 2020 alone, at least 10 Chinese startups received new funding rounds. For example, startups Audox 2020 received a license from the Shanghai authorities to use 100 unmanned cars to transport passengers at once. In the beginning, such cars must necessarily have an operator. But he does not have to drive the car, it is enough just to be present. Now the service is working in the test mode, and by order of the Shanghai Mayor's office, travel is free for passengers. The developers are also interested in China because the local traffic is different from European or American. Here on the roads there are a lot more pedestrians and motorcycles, is exactly what the computer driving a car needs to learn how to drive properly.